Nobody picks up a piece of rusted, filth-covered metal at a farm auction and feels their heart race. Nobody. Not the seasoned farmers, not the equipment dealers who've spent their whole careers handling steel, not the auctioneers who've called 1,000 lots and seen 1,000 piles of forgotten junk. Nobody stops at the back table, the one buried under decades of rust and neglect, and thinks, wait, nobody except one man, and what that one man knew, what he felt the moment. That blade touched his hands on a grey October morning in Iowa would echo for the next 132 years. Stay with me until the end. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Through his son, through his granddaughter, through more than 20,000 acres of broken, rocky earth, this is not a story about luck. This is not a story about stumbling onto a good deal. This is a story about what happens when one person sees the truth that everyone else has trained themselves to ignore. October 1968, Clayton County, Iowa. The sky that morning was the color of old tin, flat, gray, and cold in the way that tells you winter has already made its decision. About 40 people had gathered at the old Hendricks farm for an estate auction. Albert Hendricks had died 3 months earlier at the age of 87. He had farmed the same 240 acres since 1919. Nearly 50 years of equipment, tools, iron, and memory, piled up the way sediment piles up at the bottom of a slow river. Quietly, constantly. Until one day you look around and realize the past fills the room. His children had scattered to the cities decades ago. None of them wanted the farm. None of them wanted the life. So everything was going. The tractors, the implements, the hand tools, the odds and ends that accumulate in a farming life the way rust accumulates on steel left out in the rain. Most of the 40 people there that morning had their eyes on the big-ticket items, the tractors, the combines, the things with obvious, explainable market value, the things you could point at and know exactly what you had. Clarence Webb was not most. Clarence was 34 years old that morning. He farmed 180 acres about 6 miles north, and in the county he was known for 2 things. He worked harder than almost anyone, and he understood metal in a way that made other people slightly uncomfortable, the way someone who has spent years learning to hear music makes a casual listener feel a little exposed. That second gift came from his father, Walter Webb, who had been a blacksmith in Clayton County from 1915 until 1938, when the Depression and the flood of factory-made tools finally killed the trade. For 23 years, Walter had worked every kind of steel that passed through northeastern Iowa, American steel, German steel, English steel, and occasionally, rarely, Swedish steel. Clarence had grown up in that shop. He'd watched his father shape metal the way other boys watched their fathers shape soil. He'd learned to read steel the way a musician learns to hear the note that's slightly off, not from a textbook, not from a classroom, but from thousands of hours of quiet, attentive watching. His father had never sat him down and formally taught him. But knowledge doesn't always need a classroom. Sometimes it just passes, hand to hand, patient as iron cooling in the dark. At the Hendricks auction, while other bidders clustered around the tractors and argued over horsepower and tire condition, Clarence drifted to the back. To the table nobody was paying attention to, the one piled with rusted hand tools, wrenches, hammers, chains, blades, all of it covered in years of neglect, all of it looking exactly like what it appeared to be, the forgotten debris of a long life, the kind of stuff you toss into a scrap pile without a second thought, because a second thought takes time, and time is the one thing farmers never have enough of. Most people who passed that table didn't even slow their stride. Clarence stopped. He reached into the pile and pulled out a plow blade from the very bottom. It was large, about 2 feet, long 8 inches wide, so completely coated in rust that you could barely make out what it was. The kind of object that, at a glance, doesn't even register as worth touching, let alone buying. But Clarence didn't judge things at a glance. That was not how his father had taught him to look at metal. He turned the blade over slowly in both hands. He scraped at the surface with his thumbnail, just enough to clear a small patch. And what he saw in that tiny patch of exposed steel made him go completely still. The color was wrong. Not wrong, bad. Wrong, rare. Not the flat, familiar gray. Of ordinary iron. Something deeper, something denser, a darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The kind of surface you don't forget once you've seen it. He'd seen it once before. In his father's shop, there had been a chisel that Walter Webb treated differently from all his other tools. It lived wrapped in oilcloth, apart from everything else. Walter handled it with the particular care you give something that cannot be replaced. Swedish steel, his father had told him once, holding the chisel up in the light. Made before the First War. From a process they don't use anymore. This thing can cut through anything, and it never loses its edge, never chips. If you ever find old Swedish steel out in the world, Clarence, you hold on to it. It is worth more than gold to a man who understands what he's holding. Clarence looked at the rusted plough blade in his hands. Same weight, same density, same darkness under the rust, he knew. Finding any treasures? Dale Mercer, the John Deere dealer from town, was walking toward him with a paper cup of coffee and the easy grin of a man who already knew how the conversation was going to end. Dale was well liked in the county, experienced, confident. He sold farming equipment for a living, which meant he handled more steel than most people ever would. He knew quality when he saw it, or so he believed. Just looking, Clarence said. Dale glanced at the blade and laughed, the warm, generous laugh of someone sharing an obvious truth. Clarence, that thing is not worth the rust it's buried under. Old Hendricks hadn't touched it in 20 years at least. Look at it. It's practically decomposed. It's got good weight. Good weight? Dale laughed again. It's heavy, because it's solid rust. Probably crumble apart the second you try to mount it. Listen, I've got brand new American steel at the dealership. $45. Guaranteed 2 full seasons. Not this museum piece. I might buy this one anyway. Dale stared at him. Then he burst out laughing. For what? $5 scrap. Value. Tell you what, Clarence. I'll give you $5 right now not to bid on it. Save you the embarrassment. I think I'll take my chances. Dale walked away, still shaking his head, already telling someone nearby about the crazy farmer interested in the pile of decomposed rust. The laughter spread through the crowd, light, easy, comfortable. The laughter of people who have already decided what something is and find it amusing that anyone might see it differently. Clarence didn't react. He didn't look up. He just stood there holding the blade, feeling its weight. He had learned a long time ago that people who laugh at what they don't understand aren't saying anything about the thing they're laughing at. They're only saying something about themselves. The plough blade came up near the end, bundled with a collection of other rusty implements. The auctioneer called it miscellaneous hand tools, sold as lot. Who gives me 20 for the lot? Silence. 15. Nothing. $10. Come on, folks. Someone gives me 10. A hand went up in the back. $10. Clarence raised his hand. At 15. The other bidder dropped out immediately. Nobody else moved. Going once, going twice. 20. Dale Mercer. Standing at the back, one hand raised, a grin on his face that had gone from warm to sharp. This wasn't generosity anymore. This was a man who needed to win a joke he'd already started. The crowd stirred. This was entertainment now. Watching Clarence. Webb throw real money at what everyone could plainly see was worthless scrap. 25, Clarence said without hesitation. 30. Just to see how high our friend here will go for a pile of rust. The crowd chuckled. 35. Dale's smile flickered. He hadn't expected Clarence to keep going. But the joke was in motion now, and he wasn't backing down in front of a crowd that was watching. 40. 45. The crowd went quiet. This had stopped being funny somewhere around $40. This was 2 men in a standoff over a pile of rust that nobody else would have paid $10 for. People stopped talking and just watched. 50, Dale said, and there was no grin in it this time. 55. Dale looked at Clarence. Clarence looked at the blade. $60, just to prove a point. Dale's jaw tightened. You know what? He's all yours, Clarence. Enjoy your expensive rust collection. The crowd laughed again. But it was a different kind of laughter now. Nervous, off-key. Something had shifted in that bidding that nobody quite knew how to name. Clarence Webb had paid $55, reduced to $30, after the other items in the lot sold separately, for what looked, to every single person watching, like worthless scrap. And he did not look like a man who had made a mistake. He looked like a man who had just found exactly what he came for. When Clarence got home, he didn't rush. He understood, the way his father had taught him, that the steel under that rust was old and rare and needed to be treated with patience. Power tools and harsh chemicals strip away more than rust. They strip away the surface of the steel itself, the very layer that holds the edge. Impatience destroys what patience preserves. He'd known that since he was 8 years old. He spent 3 days cleaning the blade, oil and careful scraping, layer by layer, decade by decade, removing what time had deposited. On the first day, the rust was thick and dark. On the second day, he could see the shape of the steel more clearly. On the third day, the metal came through, and it was extraordinary. Dark and dense, perfectly smooth, a surface that absorbed light instead of throwing it back. He ran his thumb slowly along the edge and felt the bite of it, precise and clean and certain. Still sharp, after years of abandonment, after rust that had built up season by season, after sitting at the bottom of a pile that 40 people walked past without a second look, still sharp. Then he turned the blade over and found the 3 words he'd been hoping for, stamped into the steel near the base, where it would attach to the plough frame. Sandvik, Sweden, 1892, Sandvik. Founded in 1862 in Sandviken, Sweden. One of the most accomplished steel operations ever built. They had figured out, in the second half of the 19th century, a way to combine exceptionally pure Swedish iron ore with precise amounts of carbon, heated and cooled, through processes so exacting that the resulting steel was harder, more durable, and more consistent than almost anything else being made anywhere in the world. Their blades were exported globally. They were legendary. A Sandvik blade could cut through rocky soil that would chip and destroy ordinary steel. It could work for decades with minimal care, but the original process was expensive, slow, and labor-intensive. As the 20th century progressed, Sandvik modernized. Faster production, lower cost, still good steel. Just not the same steel. The original process died out around the time of the First World War, which meant that Clarence Webb, sitting in his barn in 1968, was holding something that had not been made in over 50 years. Something that could not be made again. Not by any company. Not for any price. He had paid $30 for something irreplaceable. He sat with that for a long moment. Then he oiled the blade, hung it on a hook in the barn, and went to bed. Spring, 1969. Clarence mounted the Sandvik blade on his plough frame. It fit almost perfectly. Plough dimensions hadn't changed dramatically in a century. After a minor adjustment, it was ready. He started with his North 40, the worst field he had. The rockiest, hardest, most unforgiving soil on his entire 180 acres. The field that ate plough blades the way a bad winter eats firewood. Most farmers in the county expected to replace their blades every 2 to 3 seasons just from working ground like that. It was the cost of doing business. You bought a blade, you used it up, you bought another. Clarence ploughed the North 40 in 2 days. When he dismounted the blade and examined it, there were no chips. No dull spots, no wear marks. The edge was as sharp as the moment he'd first felt it under his thumb after 3 days of cleaning, which is to say, as sharp as the day it left a Swedish factory in 1892. He ploughed the rest of his 180 acres over the following week. Same result every time. The blade moved through the soil the way it was built to move through soil. Clean, precise, quiet. At the end of the season, he examined the blade one final time. 76 years old, a complete Iowa season of work. Rocky fields, heavy, compacted soil, the kind of ground that punishes lesser metal, and the blade looked like it had barely been used. Dale Mercer came by in June, ostensibly to talk about a tractor, but Clarence knew the real reason. He could see it in the way Dale's eyes scanned the barn, looking for the new blade, looking for evidence that he'd been right all along. "So how's that rusty blade working out for you? Need a replacement yet? I've got American steel at the dealership, $45, guaranteed 2 seasons. "Come look," Clarence said. He led Dale to the barn wall. The Sandvik blade was hanging there, clean, oiled, the dark steel catching the light from the window in that particular way that old dense steel does. Dale looked at it, then leaned closer, then reached out slowly and touched the edge with his thumb. That's still sharp." "Yes. You worked it all season?" "Every acre. Started with the North 40. Dale was quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when someone is recalculating something they thought was already settled. "What kind of steel is that?" Clarence pointed to the stamp. "Sandvik, Sweden, 1892. They don't make it like this anymore." Dale started to say something and stopped. He knew where Clarence had gotten it. He'd been standing right there. He'd laughed. He'd bid the price up just to make the whole thing funnier. $30, Clarence said quietly. "That's what I paid." "How much do yours cost?" $45. "And they last 2 seasons, maybe 3 on a good year." Dale didn't answer. "I've had this one a single season, and it's still perfect." "Let's see where it is in 20. Dale Mercer never brought up the blade again, not once, in all the years that followed. Let me stop the story here for a moment, because this is the part that most people miss when they hear it. Dale Mercer was the John Deere dealer. He sold farming equipment for a living. He handled steel constantly. He had spent his entire career around tools, blades, implements. By every reasonable measure, Dale Mercer was the expert in that conversation at the Hendricks farm. So why did he miss it? Because he looked at the outside and stopped there. He saw rust and concluded, worthless. He saw age and concluded, junk. He saw something that looked like debris and never once asked himself whether what a thing appears to be and what a thing actually is might be 2 different things. He had enough knowledge to be confident, but not enough knowledge to be curious. And confidence without curiosity is just a faster way to be wrong. Clarence Webb had no formal training, no metallurgy degree, no agricultural college. But he had something Dale Mercer didn't: specific, inherited, hands-on knowledge from a man who had worked steel with his bare hands for 23 years. He knew what that particular weight meant. He knew what that particular darkness meant. He knew because someone who loved him had taken the time to make sure he knew. He didn't guess. He didn't get lucky. He recognized. That is the difference knowledge makes, not the broad, general knowledge that fills textbooks and makes people confident. The specific, personal, practiced knowledge that gets passed from one set of hands to another. The kind that lets you stop at a table everyone else walked past and know, with certainty, that what you're holding is not what it looks like. Let me tell you about the numbers. Because the numbers tell their own version of the story. Tom Reinhardt farmed 200 acres just south of Clarence. He kept detailed records the way good farmers do. On average, he replaced his plow blades every 3 years, sometimes 2 if the soil was rough, sometimes 4 if he was fortunate. At $45 a blade, that worked out to roughly $60 to $90 a year. By 1975, just 6 years after Clarence bought his blade, Tom had spent over $200 on replacements. Clarence's total, $30. The gap was already nearly $200 by 1980, $400 difference. By 1985, $600. By 1988, when Clarence retired and handed the farm to his son Warren, the gap had crossed $1,000, and that's before accounting for the time spent swapping blades, the downtime when a blade failed mid-season. at the worst possible moment, and the fuel savings from a sharper edge that cuts cleaner through compacted Iowa earth. One blade, 20 seasons, $30, against more than $1,000 in replacements. Against the constant churn of tools bought, worn down, discarded, and forgotten. Every single year, the Sandvik blade hung on that barn wall at the end of the season, cleaned and oiled, ready. Every single spring, it came down and went back to work. No drama, no fanfare, just 20 years of quiet, uninterrupted proof. By 1975, every farmer in Clayton County knew about it. Not as a curiosity, as a legend. At the feed store, people started asking about it with a kind of half-joking reverence. "How's the blade, Clarence?" Like asking about a member of the family, like asking about something that had earned its place. And everyone understood it. Clarence always gave the same answer. Still sharp. In 1988, a man named Arthur Lindqvist drove up to the Webb farm from Minnesota, about 60 years old, well-dressed. He introduced himself as a collector of antique Scandinavian tools, specifically pre-war Sandvik steel. He had heard about the blade. Word had gotten further than Clayton County. Clarence led him to the barn without any ceremony. Arthur examined the blade the way an expert examines something rare, slowly, methodically, turning it over, studying the file. Stamp, running his fingers along the edge. Then he went very quiet. "Do you understand how rare this is?" he finally said. "I know it's old. Old and perfect." Arthur's voice had shifted. There was something in it that was not professional composure anymore. Sandvik stopped making agricultural blades around 1905. First-generation production, 1892. You've used it for 20 years and the edge is still this sharp. Never needed sharpening, just oiled it at the end of every season. Arthur shook his head slowly. The original Swedish process. Modern metallurgists have studied these old blades extensively and still cannot fully replicate the properties. The science is understood, but the practical execution, the way the original craftsman actually did it, has been lost for 50 years. What's it worth? To a collector, $2,500, possibly $3,000 to the right buyer. There's a museum in Stockholm that would very much want this piece. Clarence was quiet for a moment. "I'm not selling." "May I ask why?" "That's an extraordinary return on your investment." Clarence thought about how to say it. About the morning in October 1968 when everyone laughed. About his father's voice in the blacksmith shop. About 20 years of ploughing the North 40 without ever buying a replacement blade. "This blade has worked my fields for 20 years. It's part of my farm, part of my family. My father taught me to recognize quality steel, and this is the best I've ever found. You can't put a price on that." "Everything has a price, Mr. Webb." Arthur nodded slowly. He understood. He was a collector. He knew exactly the weight of that answer. "If you ever change your mind, please call me. That blade belongs in a museum. But I respect your decision to keep it working." Clarence never called. Clarence Webb died in 2003 at the age of 69. He had farmed his land until his early 60s, then gradually stepped back as Warren took over. Warren, who had inherited his father's work ethic and his grandfather's eye for what other people couldn't see. The Sandvik blade was still on the barn wall when Clarence passed. Warren took it down, turned it over in his hands, and felt the same thing his father had felt at the Hendricks auction 35 years earlier. The same weight, the same density, the edge that had never dulled. Warren used the blade for another 12 seasons. Same routine every year. Mount it in spring, clean and oil it in fall, hang it back on the wall. It never chipped. It never needed sharpening. It never asked for anything more than its annual oiling. In 2015, Warren's daughter Emma took over the farm. 4th generation on that land, 3rd generation to use the blade. By then, it was 123 years old, older than the farm itself. Emma had it appraised. The collector market had grown significantly since Arthur Lindqvist's visit. A verified first-generation Sandvik agricultural blade from 1892, in working condition, not preserved behind glass, but actually used across 3 generations of farming, was something the appraiser said he'd never encountered. Between $8,000 and $12,000. Emma didn't sell it. Of course she didn't. Grandpa always said some things are worth more kept than sold, she told the reporter who came to write the story. This isn't just a tool. It's a lesson about quality, about patience, about looking past the surface to see what's actually there. Do you still use it? The reporter asked. Every spring. Same fields my grandfather plowed. Doesn't it seem like a waste, using something that valuable? Emma looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the blade, hanging on the wall in the barn light, the Sandvik stamp as clear as the day it was struck into the steel in 1892. That's exactly what the John Deere dealer said in 1968. When my grandfather bought it for $30 and everybody laughed. She paused. Grandpa had the last laugh, and so does this blade, every single season. The blade is still there. In the barn on the Webb farm in Clayton County, Iowa. On the same hooks Clarence installed in the late 1960s, cleaned and oiled, waiting for spring. 2 years old, over 20,000 acres plowed, 3 generations of one family. On the wall beneath it, a small metal plaque Warren installed years ago, Sandvik steel, 1892 purchased 1968. 30 they laughed. It never dulled. Every spring, Emma takes it down, mounts it on the plow, works the same fields her great-grandfather worked. The steel bites into the Iowa earth the same way it has since 1969. Sharp, clean, true. The John Deere dealership where Dale Mercer laughed at Clarence has changed hands 4 times. Dale himself died in 1994. People who knew him said he never fully let go of that day at the Hendricks auction. He'd bring it up occasionally, usually when he was proven wrong about something, and call it luck. It wasn't luck. What Clarence Webb did on that grey October morning required specific knowledge he had spent a lifetime collecting, through watching, through listening, through inheriting the hard-won understanding of a father who worked steel with his hands for 23 years. It required courage, the willingness to act on what you know when the people around you are openly laughing at you for knowing it. It required patience. 3 days of careful cleaning, 20 years of annual oiling, a lifetime of trusting what he'd been taught. And it required a kind of deep, steady faith. Not the religious kind, but the kind that comes from genuine knowledge. The kind that lets you stand in a crowd of laughing people, holding something they've all dismissed, and think calmly, I know what this is. I know what I'm holding, and no amount of laughter changes what I know. That is not luck. That is wisdom. Here is what I want you to carry away from this story. Not the financial lesson, though the math is real and it's worth sitting with. Not just the practical lesson about buying quality over cheap, though that's real too. This. Somewhere. In your life right now, there is something that looks like rust. Something that the experts around you have walked past. Something that the confident, knowledgeable, well-connected people in your world have already decided is worthless, and told you so. Loudly, sometimes with laughter. The question is not whether those people know things. Dale Mercer knew things. The question is whether they have the right knowledge, the specific, particular, lived knowledge required to recognize what they're actually looking at, or whether they have just enough to be confident, which, as Clarence Webb demonstrated, can be the most dangerous kind of knowing there is. The other question is whether you have what Clarence had, not just the knowledge to recognize it, but the courage to act on that recognition, the patience to do the work, the faith to hold on when everyone around you has already moved on, because real quality doesn't rush through, it waits. It waits for the person who knows what to look for. It waits for the one person who stops at the table everyone else walks past, picks up what everyone else has dismissed and says, I know what this is, and I'm not putting it down.